This is the story of the Louis Frederick and Frederica Gelbaugh Zelle, part of the Zelle family. I am Lou Zelle, Louis Franklin Zelle, born 1917, soon to be 85, and we're talking this day, the day after Thanksgiving 2002. The first pictures you're going to see are those of my grandpa and grandma, Louis Frederick and Frederica Gelbaugh Zelle. The children, their children, were Lucy, Fred, Minnie, Oscar, Ella, and Carl, and a baby Marie who died in infancy. Lee Dennison, L.L. Dennison, was the husband of Lucy, the oldest daughter, and you will see them here in their house. Their son Lee was a dentist. He and Helen Schlegel had no children. John and Minnie Zelle Tendick had 6 children, who were Harold, Eugene, Mildred, Wilfred, Paul, and John Ed. Fred Zelle married Mabel Cook, and they had 6 children: Edgar, Elsie, Robert, John, Gordon, and Dorothy. Ella Zelle married Roy Moore, and they had 2 sons, Ralph and Rel. Ralph was an instructor and professor of dentistry at Washington University, and Rel was career Navy, a commander in the Navy. Oscar Zelle, Dr. Zelle, married Bess Kane Zelle, and they had 1 son, Kane. The youngest was Carl Alfred Zelle, my father, who married Helen Sams, and they had 2 children, myself, Louis Franklin, and Helen Jane Zelle. Hopefully that'll identify them. I think my cousin Lee was taking these pictures. You will see him later.
And what year is this again?
This is about 1927 or 1928. And this is my grandpa. That's Louis Frederick Zelle. And this is his barn. There he is and Grandma, Frederica Gelbaugh Zelle, my grandparents. And that's Frederica. She was a fine lady. That's Grandpa. And she's going back in the house. Did you see her go there? That's the old homestead in Lake Fork, Illinois. Now, my father, Carl, was born there. Again, this is a shot of the road, the lane up to their house. This house was built in about 1890. I think Dad said it cost him like $1,400 to build a house back then. There's Grandpa's sheep. He loved that. There they are. Now, he had the first car, an old 1919 Dodge, I think it was, or maybe a little later. He gets in. Now, watch, Grandma will not ride in the front seat with him, but she gets in the back seat. She's got the door stuck there. Finally gets it open and gets in. And there they go. Why she wouldn't ride with him in the front seat, no one knows. This is Aunt Lucy and Uncle Doc Dennison's house. He was a small-town doctor there. The old original house burned. That's Uncle Doc. And this house behind him, they ordered from Sears and Roebuck. The whole house. That's Uncle Dennis. He was from West Virginia. There's their daughter-in-law, Helen Schlegel Dennison. Her husband was Lee, who's taking the pictures, and he died quite early. That's Aunt Lucy. She was the oldest of the children. Used to love to go down there to her house. This is Aunt Lucy there. I'm not sure who that is. All right, now we're back to, this is Aunt Lucy's house there from a distance. Again, that's the house that they ordered from Sears and Roebuck, and this must have been about, 1928, 29 when they bought it. This was in the little town of Lake Fork, Illinois, on the Illinois Central Tracks. The house before this one was a beautiful big old Victorian home, which I love to go down and visit, but it burned down. And this is the one that they replaced it with. The other one was a lot more beautiful. This is Aunt Lucy again. She looks so much younger there than I remember her. Of course, I was a little kid then. This is Aunt Ella and Uncle Roy's house about 1.25 miles north of Lake Fork. Aunt Ella was a sister, I believe, just older than my father, Carl. She was married to Roy, that's Uncle Roy, and I think he was the farmer was kind of a part-time sheriff or associate sheriff there in Logan County. There's Uncle Roy and Aunt Ella on their farm. They're the parents of Ralph and Rel, which I introduced earlier. Again, Roy and Ella. I remember this is about 1929. 1928, something like that. I liked Aunt Ella. She was a dear. I never liked Uncle Roy. He's kind of a mean old son. Aunt Ella and her chickens. She always raised a lot of them, as all the farm women did then. That's Ralph. He was the one who was a dentist, or taught, was a professor of dentistry at Washington University in St. Louis. I loved him too. He was a great guy. And his brother Rel, he was career Navy, became a commander, and was so into. Can you see on the barn back up there? You may see his name. He painted it in big letters, Rel, so that the aviators going over would see it. And that's Aunt Ellie again and their dog. Now we're back. That's Rel more on the left and Ralph. All right, now we're at Aunt Minnie and Uncle John's home, and I used to love to go up there and visit in the summertime. And we'd go into town on Saturday nights, and then mobs of kids would come back and spend the night with her. Aunt Minnie never knew how many kids she'd have for Sunday morning breakfast. And there is Paul on the left and John Ed on the right. There's Will and Minnie and John and Harold and it was the rest of the family there. John Ed is the little one in front, and Paul is the one on the right, and I am between those two in age. There's Minnie and Uncle John again. Uncle John, to show something about his character, back in the early years, he recommended that a lot of his friends invest in some Louisiana land. Well, the thing turned out, I don't remember whether it was a scam or whether it was just a business deal that went wrong. But anyway, Uncle John paid back to all those people that he had recommended and that they lost money in. He himself paid all those people back, and it took him a lifetime to do it almost. Again, Uncle John and Aunt Minnie, I loved them too. She was a good pie and pork chops for breakfast when you went to Aunt Minnie's house. And they retired and moved into Mount Pulaski. That's Harold. That was the oldest child. These were all nice kids. And there's Eugene Tendick, married Mildred Hahn. There's Mutz, or Mildred was her name. We loved her. She was something else. She was a kick. Just full of it. All the time. Yeah. And that was Wilfred. He was the hunter and real explorer, adventurer of the family. That's Paul, or we called him Duke. And then the next one will be, that's John Ed. Now, he was younger than I am. Paul was just older. I was in between those two. So I'd love to go out to the farm there. And that's their farm, machine shed. And Uncle John had 3 steam engines. This was back when most people were working with horses. He had 3 steam engines. That's their cattle lot there. Now, this is about 1 mile west of Mount Pulaski, Illinois. More of their cattle, or sheep, I guess those are. Now this is Chestnut, Illinois, and that's Uncle Fred's grain elevator there in the back. And this is their home. Now, remember Uncle Fred's children, I think the older ones had left by now. Edgar and Elsie and Robert and John and Gordon and Dorothy. Now there's John on the left, Uncle Fred, Aunt Mabel, Gordon, and Dorothy. That's Uncle Fred, my uncle. I liked him too, and Aunt Mabel. Aunt Mabel died kind of early, and Uncle Fred remarried again. This was the oldest son, Edgar, and his wife, Onita. Her name had been Onita Schaefer before she married Edgar. He became an accountant for Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, and then they moved to Texas. Lived out the rest of their lives there. These are all, people are all gone now. Jane, Dorothy, and I are the only ones of all these people that are left. That's Gordon Zelle. He was a little older than I am. He was one of my good cousin friends. And that's Dorothy. Dorothy, still living, she lives in Wisconsin. Now next you're going to see a picture of Dorothy and my sister Jane with their doll buggy coming up this right. That's Dorothy and Jane. You can see Jane was born in 1925. Both of them were about, so you can figure out about when this was taken. All right, now this is at my home in Tolono. That's Aunt Bess and Mom, and that's me and Kane and Jane and Uncle Oscar and Carl. There's our family elevator in Tolono, Illinois. And that's Dad there and Uncle Oscar. Now Uncle Oscar and Jane. Uncle Oscar was a surgeon, a good surgeon, and kept up to things and but he was very unconventional. For instance, in wintertime, he'd do his hospital rounds in the morning in high-top boots and an old plaid shirt. And, but he was president of the Springfield, Illinois Hospital there for association for years, so he was well regarded. But as you will see in a few minutes, a real cutout, a lovable guy. And again, that's my father and my sister Jane, Carl, and Helen Jane was her name. There, that's Uncle Oscar. And that's my mother, Helen Sam Zelle. There's Uncle Oscar again. And that's Jane, and there's Jane. That was Dad, and that's Aunt Bess Kane Zelle. That's me on the left, and Cousin Kane on the right. That was what we wore back then. We're beside the yard. That's the Methodist church that we went. That's me on the left and Kane on the right, and that's me there. Louis. And the Methodist church we went to in the background, that's Kane. He's the one that became a doctor also. He was an obstetrician. There's Carl and Aunt Bess and Oscar just hanging out around the house there. Aunt Bess. Carl and Oscar. One day, one weekend, I don't know, the whole family was gone. So Dad invited Uncle Oscar and Uncle Fred over for the three brothers just to hang out during the day. So I guess Dad probably did the cooking. And they got through and went in the afternoon. So Uncle Oscar said, "You guys go on in the living room, sit down. I'll clean up the kitchen and do the dishes." So Fred and Carl went in the living room and sat down. After a while, Oscar came in, wiping his hands on the towel, all cleaned up. And that was great. Well, after a while, Fred and Oscar drove back to Springfield, left there, and Dad went out in the kitchen, happened to open the oven door. Uncle Oscar had shoved all the dirty dishes into the oven, all the leftovers, all the food, and everything was in the oven. He left it for Dad to clean up. So that was Uncle Oscar. Always doing things like that. Oh, there we've got Aunt Frances up in front of us. She married, this was my mother's youngest sister, Frances Sams Schultz. She and her husband, Ben, lived in Parsons, Kansas. And Ben died, I don't know, some time ago. Well, Frances did too. Frances she and Grandma Sam's lived in Kelowna for a while, and actually lived with us there for a little while. There she is again. That's Frances. I liked her too. That's Carl holding Frances. She didn't want her picture taken, I guess. Now we're in Springfield, and this is Uncle Oscar's new offices that I guess he built, and they went into, and his son Cain had his office there with him for a while too. This is Lee Dennison there. He had married Helen Schlegel, and he was a dentist, practicing dentist there in Springfield, and he got, I guess it was pneumonia or flu, and died. And I know my Uncle Oscar said if sulfa could have been invented 6 months earlier, he could have saved his life. But at that point, the medication, sulfa and those drugs weren't there, and it was real sad. And then he was there, Lucy and L.L. Dennison, Doc's only child, and so they had no heirs down the line from them. Now these pictures were taken about 20 years later. As I said, I guess those others were 28 or 29. This is 1947. Actually, Ruth and Carla and Davy and I were in Africa while these pictures were being taken, and I think either Carl or Bud Hutchins took these. I'm not sure who. Again, we're going back to the old home place. This is in Lake Fork, Illinois now. This is the very place we started out the earlier film with. That's the home place. This is down to Aunt Lucy. This is the house that Lucy and Doc bought from Sears and Roebuck and had shipped there. See how 20 years later, how different Uncle Doc looks, and Aunt Lucy they've had 20 years put on them. And actually, this is kind of the way I best remember. There's Uncle John and Minnie Tendick's house again, and again, 1947. This was the house that they retired to in Mount Pulaski. Uncle John was so tickled over the fact that in the winter he didn't have to shovel coal, but he just hit a thermostat and turned on the heat. He just bragged about this. Anyway, here's the family. Remember the little kids that we saw 20 years ago? This is Uncle John, that Minnie there on the left, and the boys all grown up. And at this point, that's Will in the front there, just to the right. I can't recognize the others from this film. That's again Minnie and John. 20 years later, his hobby was collecting these, I think, Tiffany-type lamps. This is a house where Uncle Fred retired. Aunt Mabel had died now, and he had remarried. And there's Uncle Fred and my cousin Dorothy. Again, she's 20 years older. Remember the little girl pushing the doll buggy? Mm-hmm. Well, there's Dorothy now. And here we're back to Uncle Roy at Aunt Ella's house out on the farm. And there they are 20 years later. We've all aged in 20 years. And there's our house in Kelowna. And I think that's the 1936 Buick, which Dad and Mom had. Now there's Jane and Bud. And I think they've just been married here a year or so. It was 1947, this is when they were married. Bud Hutchins. And there's Dad and Mom, Carl and Helen, again at the house in Kelowna. Jane and Bud. Oh, this is Jane's cat. I can't remember her cat's name. She's going to give me a bad time because I can't, but I can't remember. There's Uncle Oscar again, and Fred and Carl. There's the three brothers. This could have been the time he pulled the food in the oven stunt, but that's the three brothers there. There's Uncle Oscar's car. There he is 20 years later. The whole family just loved him. He really did. There's that Bess. Yeah. You could just see it in his eyes. And that's from their front porch. They sold their home in Springfield and bought a house out on their home out on Lake Springfield. And this was their front yard looking down on the lake there. And that's from the looking back at their house. Oh yeah, that's Uncle Oscar's dog. I can't remember the dog's name either. Now there's Josephine and Jim. That's Helen's middle sister, Josephine Sams Brown. And they lived in Tulsa and Kansas City. And then Jim died not fairly early, and then Josephine was in the Chicago area for a while. And that's Helen and Josephine there. My mother and my Aunt Josephine. And there's Uncle Jim. And I guess that's Helen. Yeah, and Josephine at our house. That's in the backyard in Kelowna, and that's Uncle Jim. Uncle Jim was a salesman. Typical professional salesman. Sold lots of things, traveling salesman. And there's Ben and Frances. They lived in Parsons, Kansas, and Ben worked for the grocery store there. Ben Schultz, he was from Humboldt, Kansas. That's the house where I lived when I was 4, 5, 6 years old in second grade. That's my mother's mother, Jenny Kittle Sams, and I think that's Richard, my nephew Richard there. Richard Hutchins, I'm not sure, but I think so. But Jenny lived with us for a while. Is that it?
I think that appears to be it.
Oh, that brought back some memories as I watched it.
I can only imagine. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, let me just think a minute.
Or maybe we should, we'll come back.
Well, here we are, 72 or 73 years after that first picture you saw. That young boy hitting the ball and catching it, that was me 72 years ago. And here we are all this time later. I want to tell you just briefly about my grandma, that first lady you saw, Frederica. Frederica had about a third grade education, but she was the one of the people who started our Christian faith in this family and handed it on down. She went to the German service in Lutheran. She was a faithful Lutheran. And even I can remember being in Mount Pulaski on Saturday night, sitting in the drugstore, would you believe, discussing church things with my cousins when they hung out on Saturday night? Anyway, this is what I want to pass on to you. And today the family belongs to Presbyterian, United Church of Christ, Methodist, Episcopal, many of them. And that isn't a matter, just as long as we retain our faith in Christ and that He is preeminent in our lives. And that's the heritage I want to leave with you. Bless you all. Amen.